Chapter 1: The Return. The rental car's air conditioning hummed against the Texas heat as I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home. 5 years. It had been 5 years since I'd last made this drive, and everything felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. The oak tree in the front yard had grown taller, its branches now touching the roof of the wraparound porch where my mother's wind chimes still sang their metallic lullaby. I sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, watching the curtains twitch in the front window. Mom was waiting, probably had been for the past hour, checking the clock and peering through the lace panels she'd hung when I was in middle school. Some things never changed in Millfield, Texas. Population 3,847. My phone buzzed with notifications from San Francisco, emails from my startup, messages from friends asking about weekend plans, reminders of the life I'd built 3,000 miles away, a life that made perfect sense to me, but would sound like gibberish to the people waiting inside this house. The front door opened before I could reach for my suitcase. "Maya!" My mother's voice carried that particular mixture of joy and worry that I remembered so well. She hurried down the porch steps in her sensible flats, her graying hair perfectly styled despite the humidity. "Hi, Mom." I let her fold me into a hug that smelled like lavender and vanilla, the same perfume she'd worn for as long as I could remember. She felt smaller in my arms, more fragile, and I wondered when that had happened. "You look thin," she said, pulling back to examine my face. "And pale. Don't they have sun in California?" "They do. I just spend most of my time indoors." I grabbed my bag from the trunk, noting how she didn't comment on my jeans and t-shirt. Progress, maybe. Dad appeared on the porch, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "There's my girl." His smile was warm, but cautious, like he wasn't sure if I was the same daughter who'd left, or someone entirely different. Maybe I wasn't sure either. The house welcomed me back with its familiar creaks and sighs. Nothing had changed. The same family photos lined the hallway, the same floral wallpaper covered the dining room walls, the same ceramic rooster sat on the kitchen windowsill. It was like stepping into a museum of my former life. "Sarah's coming for dinner tomorrow," Mom said, bustling around the kitchen, checking on something in the oven. "She's so excited to see you. Did you know she made partner at the law firm? Youngest one in the county." "That's great." I poured myself a glass of water from the tap, tasting the metallic hint of well water that city living had made me forget. "How is she?" "Oh, wonderful, just wonderful. Engaged to that nice Richardson boy. You remember Tom? His family owns the hardware store. They're planning a spring wedding." Mom's voice had that bright, brittle quality it took on when she was particularly pleased about something, or when she was trying to be. "Sarah always was the responsible one," Dad said, settling into his recliner with a grunt. The same recliner he had since I was 10, now held together with duct tape and stubbornness. Good head on her shoulders. The implication hung in the air like humidity. Sarah had stayed close, followed the expected path, made the right choices. Sarah was the success story. I was the cautionary tale who'd run off to chase dreams that still, 5 years later, probably made no sense to them. I climbed the stairs to my old room as the sun began to set, painting the walls the same golden color I remembered from countless evenings spent here. My twin bed still wore the same pink comforter, though it looked smaller now. The walls were covered with participation ribbons and honor roll certificates, evidence of a girl who'd tried so hard to be perfect that she'd forgotten to be herself. On the nightstand sat a photo I'd forgotten about. Sarah and me at 16, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. We'd been inseparable then, sharing secrets and dreams and plans for the future that had seemed so clear, so inevitable. She was going to be an artist, travel the world, paint in Paris. I was going to be a writer, maybe a journalist, tell stories that mattered. Looking at that photo now, I wondered what had happened to those girls and their impossible dreams. One of them had chased hers to California, built something from nothing, learned to fail and try again. The other had become exactly what everyone expected her to be. I set the photo back down and unpacked my few belongings, hanging my work clothes in the closet next to old prom dresses and graduation gowns. Tomorrow would bring the family reunion, the questions, the careful navigation of topics that had become landmines over the years. Tomorrow I would have to explain once again why I wasn't married, why I didn't have children, why my life looked nothing like the one they had imagined for me. But tonight, I was just Maya, back in her childhood room, listening to the sounds of home settle around her like a familiar blanket. Through the window, I could see the lights of downtown Millfield, all 12 blocks of it, and beyond that, the darkness of farmland stretching towards horizons I'd once dreamed of crossing. My phone buzzed again. A text from my business partner about a meeting on Monday, a world away, and yet somehow still reaching me here. I turned it face down and closed my eyes, letting the sounds of home wash over me. Tomorrow would come whether I was ready or not. Chapter 2: The Gathering Storm. Sunday dinner at the Chen household had always been a production, and some traditions apparently transcended time and circumstance. The dining room table groaned under the weight of Mom's efforts. Pot roast with vegetables, cornbread, green bean casserole, and her famous peach cobbler cooling on the counter. The good china had made its appearance, along with the cloth napkins that only came out for special occasions. I helped set the table, muscle memory guiding my hands to the correct placement of forks and knives, while Mom fussed over last-minute preparations. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting everything in that warm, golden light that photographers paid thousands to recreate, but could never quite capture. "Now, Maya," Mom said, adjusting a serving spoon for the third time, "you know Aunt Linda's going to ask about your personal life. Just try to be patient with her." "I am always patient." Dad snorted from his position by the window, watching for cars. "Patient like a rattlesnake is patient." I heard that, but I was smiling despite myself. It felt good to fall back into these old rhythms, even if they came with their complications. The first arrivals were Uncle Jim and Aunt Linda, followed quickly by my cousins Mark and Jessica with their respective broods of children. The house filled with noise and laughter, the comfortable chaos of family gathering. I submitted to hugs and exclamations about how I'd grown and changed, fielding questions about California with practiced ease. "Still single, I see," Aunt Linda observed during a brief lull in conversation. She had that particular talent for making statements sound like questions while simultaneously making them sound like accusations. "I'm still focused on my career," I replied smoothly, the same response I'd been giving for years. "Well, there's more to life than work, honey. You don't want to wake up one day and realize you've missed out on what really matters." Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't start a family war, the doorbell rang. Mom practically bounced to answer it, and I heard her delighted exclamation from the hallway. Sarah! Oh, sweetheart, you look absolutely beautiful. And she did. When Sarah entered the dining room, conversations paused mid-sentence. She wore a sundress that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a month. Her honey blonde hair styled in perfect waves, makeup applied with professional precision. She looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread titled Southern Belle Success Story. Maya! She moved toward me with her arms outstretched, and I found myself enveloped in a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and felt slightly performative. I can't believe you're finally home. Good to see you, Sarah. I stepped back to look at her properly. The face was the same, but something was different. The spark I remembered from our teenage years had been replaced by something more polished, more careful. Look at you, living your best life in Silicon Valley, she said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I want to hear everything. Dinner proceeded with usual family dynamics playing out around the table. Uncle Jim held forth on politics, while Aunt Linda peppered me with increasingly pointed questions about my life choices. The children provided blessed distraction with their chatter and requests, while Mom and Sarah's mother, my Aunt Carol, exchanged pleased looks every time someone complimented Sarah's engagement ring or mentioned the upcoming wedding. So, Maya, Tom Richardson spoke up during dessert, his arm draped possessively around Sarah's shoulders. Sarah tells me you work with computers? I run a tech startup, I corrected gently. We develop software solutions for small businesses. That sounds... He paused, clearly struggling with the concept. Complicated. It can be, but I love the problem-solving aspect of it, the creativity involved in building something from nothing. Must be nice to have hobbies, though I suppose at your age, you should be thinking about settling down. Your biological clock isn't getting any younger. The table went quiet. Even the children seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Linda, Dad's voice carried a warning tone. What? I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Look at Sarah. She's got her priorities straight. Career, family, contributing to the community. That's what happiness looks like.
I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the urge to defend myself, to explain, to justify choices that shouldn't need justification. But before I could speak, I noticed Sarah's hand trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. Everyone's path is different, Aunt Linda, I said quietly. What looks like happiness from the outside might not tell the whole story. Sarah's eyes met mine across the table, and for just a moment I saw something there. A flash of the girl I'd once known, desperate and trapped behind all that perfection. Well, I think Sarah's path looks pretty perfect to me, Tom said, squeezing her shoulder. Don't you, sweetheart? Perfect, Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, it's all perfect. But her knuckles were white where she gripped her napkin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching someone drowning in plain sight, while everyone else admired how gracefully she was going under. The conversation moved on to wedding plans and Tom's expansion of the hardware store. But I found myself watching Sarah throughout the rest of the evening. She laughed at the right moments, nodded enthusiastically when appropriate, played her part with consummate skill. But there was something hollow about it all, something that made me think of beautiful, empty houses with no one actually living inside them. After dinner, while the men retreated to the living room and the women cleaned up, I found myself alone with Sarah on the back porch. The evening air was thick with the sound of cicadas and the distant hum of air conditioning units working overtime. Your life sounds amazing, she said.
But there was no envy in her voice, just a kind of wistful sadness that made my heart ache. "It has its moments," I replied carefully. "How are you doing, Sarah? Really?" She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft I had to lean closer to hear her. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we actually followed through on those crazy plans we made when we were kids?" I remembered those nights when we'd sneak out to lie in the field behind her house, staring up at the stars and planning our escape from Millfield. She was going to paint masterpieces. I was going to write novels. We were going to see the world, make a difference, become the women we dreamed of being. "Sometimes," I admitted, but then I remembered that some of us did follow through. "Only one of us," she said quietly. "Only one of us was brave enough." Before I could ask what she meant, Tom appeared at the screen door. "There you are, babe. Ready to head home? I've got an early morning at the store." Sarah's transformation was instantaneous and complete. The sadness disappeared behind a bright smile, the slumped shoulders straightened, and she became once again the perfect fiancée. "Of course. Maya, we should have lunch this week, catch up properly." "I'd like that." I watched them leave, Tom's hand on the small of her back, Sarah waving cheerfully from the passenger seat of his truck. But I couldn't forget the look in her eyes when she'd asked about our old dreams, or the way her voice had broken when she'd called me brave. That night, lying in my childhood bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the different ways people could disappear. Some, like me, left physically, chasing dreams across the country and building new lives in new places. Others, like Sarah, seemed to vanish while standing perfectly still, becoming someone else so gradually that even they might not notice it happening. I wondered which kind of disappearing was harder to come back from, and whether it was too late to find out. Chapter 3: Echoes of the Past. The Millfield Public Library hadn't changed since I was 12. The same musty smell of old books and industrial carpet cleaner greeted me as I pushed through the heavy glass doors, seeking refuge from the morning heat and the questions I knew would be waiting for me back at home. I'd woken early, slipped out before Mom could start planning my day for me, and driven aimlessly through town until I found myself here. In high school, this had been my sanctuary, the place where I'd discovered writers who understood what it felt like to feel trapped in a small town, who'd shown me that there were other ways to live. Mrs. Patterson still worked the front desk, her silver hair now completely white, but her sharp blue eyes unchanged behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked up as I approached, and her face broke into a smile that made me feel 16 again. "Maya Chen, as I live and breathe. I heard you were back in town." News travels fast here. Faster than gossip at a church social. She came around the desk to embrace me, and I was struck by how tiny she seemed now. This woman who'd once seemed like a giant, who'd recommended books that changed my life and listened to my teenage dreams with the seriousness they deserved, barely reached my shoulder. "I still have that book you special ordered for me, the collection of Joan Didion essays. I kept meaning to return it." "Oh, honey, that was 15 years ago. I think we can call it even." She studied my face with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades reading between the lines. "How are you really doing? Not the polite answer you give at dinner parties, the real answer." It was such a relief to be asked directly, to be seen clearly, that I almost started crying right there in the middle of the library. "I'm good," I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. Different than I expected to be at 30, but good. Building something I believe in, learning every day. It's scary sometimes, but it's mine. That's what matters. A life that's yours. She paused, then added quietly, "Not everyone figures that out." Before I could ask what she meant, she was leading me toward the local history section, chatting about updates to the collection and asking about my work. But her words stayed with me as I browsed the familiar shelves, running my fingers along spines of books that once had been portals to other worlds. I was deep in a memoir about small-town journalism when I heard familiar voices from the children's section. Peering around the shelves, I saw Sarah reading to a group of preschoolers, her voice animated as she brought the story to life. For the first time since I'd been back, she looked genuinely happy. And the little rabbit decided that maybe being different wasn't so bad after all, she read, showing the colorful illustrations to her small audience. Maybe different was exactly what the world needed. The irony wasn't lost on me. After the children were collected by their parents, I made my way over to where Sarah was cleaning up the reading area. She looked up as I approached, surprise flickering across her face. "Maya, I didn't know you came here anymore." "Old habits. You're good with kids." "I volunteer here on Mondays. It's something to do." "You always loved reading to people. Remember when we used to put on those plays in your backyard? You'd make me be the audience while you performed entire novels?" A genuine smile crossed her face, the first real one I'd seen from her. "You hated every minute of it." "I loved every minute of it. You were magic when you performed." I sat down in one of the tiny plastic chairs, feeling ridiculous but not caring. "What happened to that girl who wanted to paint the world?" Sarah's hands stilled on the books. "She grew up." "That's not growing up, Sarah. That's giving up." Easy for you to say, but there was no heat in her words, just exhaustion. You got to leave. You got to become whoever you wanted to be. Some of us had to stay and become who everyone needed us to be. Says who? Says everyone. The words came out sharper than she intended, and she glanced around to make sure no one had heard. You have no idea what it's like, Maya. The expectations, the pressure, the constant feeling that everyone's watching, waiting for you to mess up. So you decided to mess up in advance by giving up everything you cared about? She turned away from me, focusing intently on arranging the books in perfect order. I didn't give up anything. I chose a stable career, a good man, a life that makes sense. That's what adults do. Is it what you wanted to do? What I wanted was irrelevant. When did you start believing that? She was quiet for so long that I thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. When I realized that wanting things just leads to disappointment, that dreams are for people who can afford to fail, that some of us have to be responsible for everyone else's happiness. I thought about the girl who used to sneak out to lie in the fields with me, talking about all the places we'd go and things we'd see. The girl who painted watercolors of imaginary cities and wrote stories about brave women who changed the world. The girl who believed that anything was possible if you wanted it badly enough. Sarah, I said gently, whose happiness are you responsible for, really? She looked at me then, and for a moment the mask slipped completely. I saw the scared, trapped woman behind all the perfect makeup and careful words. I saw my cousin, my friend, the other half of my childhood, drowning in a life that looked beautiful from the outside, but felt like a prison from within. Everyone's, she whispered, and it's killing me. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we could cross. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her back from whatever edge she was standing on. But I also knew that some rescues had to start from the inside. What if you didn't have to be? I asked. What if you could just be responsible for your own happiness and trust everyone else to handle theirs? You make it sound so simple. It's not simple. It's the hardest thing in the world. But it's possible. I know because I did it. You're brave, Maya. You always were. I'm not. You're reading stories about being different to a room full of kids while planning a wedding to a man who doesn't see you. If that's not brave, I don't know what is. She laughed, but it sounded more like crying. That's not brave. That's pathetic. No, I said firmly. Pathetic would be giving up completely. You're still fighting, even if you don't realize it. The question is whether you're ready to fight for yourself instead of against yourself. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and immediately began gathering her things. Tom's picking me up. We have a cake tasting appointment. She paused at the door, not looking back at me. Thanks for listening, Maya, but some things can't be fixed with good intentions and pep talks. Maybe not, I said to her retreating figure, but they can't be fixed without them either. After she left, I sat alone in the children's section, surrounded by picture books about brave animals and determined children who overcame impossible odds. Stories Sarah had been reading to other people's children while slowly forgetting how to be the hero of her own story. Mrs. Patterson appeared beside me, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent decades navigating between the lines of other people's stories. She used to come in here when she was little, she said quietly, always asking for books about artists and travelers, people who lived extraordinary lives. I remember thinking that girl was going to set the world on fire. She still could. Maybe. But she'd have to want to first, and want it more than she wants everyone else comfortable. I thought about that as I drove home, about the difference between wanting something and wanting it more than everything else, about the courage it took to disappoint people you loved in order to save yourself, about the girl Sarah had been and the woman she'd become, and whether it was possible to find your way back to who you were before the world convinced you to be someone else. The answers felt as distant as those stars we used to wish on, but for the first time since I'd been back, I had hope that we might still be able to reach them. Chapter 4. Beneath the Surface. The text came at midnight. Can't sleep. Meet me at our old spot. S. I stared at the message on my phone screen, debating whether this was a good idea. The Sarah I'd grown up with wouldn't have hesitated to call, to knock on my window, to demand the kind of late-night conversation that solved all the world's problems with the certainty of 18-year-old wisdom. This Sarah sent careful text messages and asked permission for things that used to be automatic. But maybe that was exactly why I needed to go. The field behind the Morgans' property hadn't changed much. The same oak tree stood sentinel at the edge of the clearing, its branches creating a canopy of shadows under the half-moon. Sarah was already there when I arrived, sitting in the grass with her knees drawn up to her chest, still wearing the sundress from dinner, but with her shoes kicked off beside her. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said without looking up as I settled beside her. "I wasn't sure you'd show up either." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of rural Texas, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through grain, the eternal symphony of insects that had provided the soundtrack to our teenage confidences. Above us, the stars spread out in a tapestry that city living had made me forget existed. "Do you remember what we used to call this place?" Sarah asked eventually. "The launching pad, because we were going to use it to blast off into our amazing futures." God, we were so naive. But she was smiling as she said it, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since I'd been back. "Were we? You became a successful lawyer. I built a company from nothing. Maybe we weren't naive. Maybe we were just young enough to believe anything was possible." "Successful." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what success looks like from the inside, Maya. It looks like getting up every morning and putting on a costume. It looks like having conversations where you nod and smile and say absolutely nothing that matters. It looks like being so good at pretending that you forget who you were before you started acting." The raw pain in her voice made my chest ache. "Sarah, I hate my job," she said in a rush, as if the words had been building pressure behind her teeth for years. "I hate corporate law and billable hours and clients who think money can solve any problem. I hate wearing suits that cost more than some people make in a month. I hate that my biggest accomplishment is making partner in a firm that would disappear tomorrow and nobody would miss it." She was crying now, tears catching the moonlight as they slipped down her cheeks. "And I hate my engagement ring because it's so big, it feels like wearing a weight that reminds me every second that I belong to someone. I hate wedding planning and choosing between eggshell and ivory linens and pretending that the most important decision I'll ever make is whether to serve chicken or beef at a reception for people I barely know." I reached for her hand, but she pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. "And I hate that I hate it all, because everyone keeps telling me how lucky I am, how perfect my life looks, how I'm living the dream." She looked at me then, her face streaked with mascara and moonlight. "But whose dream is it, Maya? Because it sure as hell isn't mine." "Then why?" "Because I'm a coward." The words came out flat, matter of fact. "Because it's easier to live someone else's idea of a perfect life than to risk failing at your own. Because I tried, Maya. After high school, I tried." She told me then about the art school acceptance letter she'd never mentioned, the scholarship to study in Portland that she'd turned down because it was not practical, about the paintings hidden in her closet that no one had seen, the portfolio she submitted to galleries that had earned nothing but polite rejection letters. So I convinced myself that art was a hobby, that I needed something stable, something respectable.
I went to law school because my parents were so proud when I got accepted. I took a job at Bradshaw and Associates because it impressed people at church. I said yes when Tom proposed because he's exactly the kind of man I was supposed to want. But he's not the man you do want. I don't know what I want anymore. I've spent so long being what other people needed that I can't remember who I am underneath it all. I thought about my own journey, the nights I'd spent crying in my first apartment in San Francisco, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. The fear that had gnawed at me every time I faced a new challenge, every time someone told me I was crazy for leaving behind everything safe and familiar. Do you know what the hardest part about following your own path is? I said. It's not the fear of failing. It's the fear of succeeding at something that doesn't matter to anyone but you. It's realizing that your definition of success might look like failure to everyone else and being okay with that anyway. How do you stand it, the disappointment in their voices when they talk about your life? I considered the question seriously. I stopped needing their approval more than I needed my own. It took years, Sarah, and it's still hard sometimes, but the alternative, living a life that looks perfect to everyone else while feeling dead inside, that was harder. What if I've waited too late? What if I'm so deep in this life that there's no way out? There's always a way out. It might not be easy, it might hurt people, it might mean starting over, but there's always a choice. She was quiet for a long time, picking at the grass between her fingers. I have a painting in my apartment, she said, one I finished last month. It's of this field, actually, but not how it looks now, how it looked in my imagination when we were kids, when we thought it really was a launching pad. What does it look like in your imagination? Wild, alive, full of possibilities. She looked up at the sky, where the same constellations we'd wished on as teenagers still traced their ancient patterns. Free. That's still there, you know. That wildness, that sense of possibility. It's just buried under years of other people's expectations. How do I dig it out? One shovelful at a time. One small choice that's yours instead of theirs. One moment of truth instead of performance. I'm scared. Good. Being scared means it matters. We talked until the sky began to lighten in the east, sharing memories and fears and the dreams we'd thought were buried forever. As the first birds began to sing, Sarah stood and brushed grass from her dress. I should get home before Tom notices I'm gone. Sarah, I called as she reached for her shoes. The painting you mentioned, I'd love to see it sometime. She paused, and for a moment I saw the artist she'd buried beneath the lawyer, the dreamer hiding behind the practical woman, the wild girl who'd once believed she could paint the world. Maybe I'd like to show it to someone who'd understand. As I watched her walk back towards town, I thought about all the different ways we imprison ourselves, and all the different keys we hold without realizing them. The sun was rising over Millfield, painting the sky in watercolors that Sarah would have captured perfectly if she'd still believed she was an artist. But maybe, just maybe, she was starting to remember.
Chapter 5. The Weight of Truth. I spent Tuesday morning walking through downtown Millfield, reacquainting myself with a place that felt like visiting a museum of my former life. The hardware store where Tom worked, the diner where we'd spent countless teenage afternoons, the church where 3 generations of my family had been married, all of it exactly as I'd left it, preserved in amber like insects from another era.
The familiarity was both comforting and suffocating. I understood now why I'd needed to leave, why staying would have meant slow death by small compromises. But I also understood for the first time why leaving felt like betrayal to the people who stayed. My phone rang as I sat on a bench outside the post office, watching the morning rhythm of small-town life unfold. The caller ID showed my business partner's name, and I answered with a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief to connect with the world I'd built, guilt that I needed to escape this one. "Maya, how's the family reunion going?" David's voice carried the background noise of our office, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the sound of a dozen young minds solving problems at light speed. "About as expected. How are things there?" "Good. The Morrison project launched successfully, and we got 3 new client inquiries yesterday. But I'm not calling about work. I'm calling because you sound like someone who's drowning on dry land." David had known me for 5 years, had seen me through every crisis and triumph of building our company. He could read my mood from a text message, which made him an excellent business partner and an occasionally inconvenient friend. "I'm fine, just processing some things." "Want to talk about it?" I found myself telling him about Sarah, about the dinner conversation, about the woman I'd known who disappeared into someone else's expectations. As I spoke, I was also telling him about my own fears, that success meant isolation, that choosing your own path meant walking it alone, that maybe the price of freedom was always going to be too high for some people to pay. "You can't save her, Maya," David said gently when I finished. "You can offer her a rope, but she has to choose to grab it." What if she can't? What if she's so deep that she doesn't remember how to want anything for herself? Then that's her choice too. The hardest thing about watching someone you love make decisions that hurt them is accepting that they're still their decisions to make. After we hung up, I sat on the bench for another hour, watching people go about their daily routines. Mrs. Henderson from the bank, who'd known me since I was born, waved from across the street. Mr. Torres, who'd taught me high school chemistry, stopped to chat about my adventures in California, as if I'd been on vacation rather than building a life. They were kind, these people who'd watched me grow up, but their kindness came with expectations, with assumptions about who I was and what I owed to the place that had shaped me. Every conversation felt like a gentle tug towards staying, towards settling down, toward becoming the version of Maya that would make sense to them. I thought about Sarah's words from the night before. Everyone keeps telling me how lucky I am. I thought about my own experience, the well-meaning relatives and family friends who still asked when I was going to get serious about my life, as if building a successful company was some kind of elaborate hobby I'd eventually outgrow. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Having lunch with wedding planner. Tom's mother insists on white roses. I wanted sunflowers. Guess which one we're getting?" I stared at the message, feeling the weight of all the small surrenders that had led her to this point. How many times had she chosen white roses over sunflowers? How many tiny compromises had accumulated into a life that felt nothing like her own? I typed back, "What if you insisted on sunflowers?" Her response came immediately. "Then I'd be the difficult bride who can't compromise." "What if you were okay with being difficult?" This time her reply took longer. "I don't know how to be okay with disappointing people." And there it was, the heart of the matter. Not the fear of failure, not the practical concerns about money or security, but the terror of letting down people who had expectations of her. The same fear that had once paralyzed me, that had made every choice feel like a betrayal of someone's vision of who I should be. I thought about my first year in San Francisco, the phone calls home that had been exercises in careful editing, how I downplayed the struggles and emphasized the small victories, trying to prove that my choice had been worth it, how I needed their approval even as I was building a life they couldn't understand. The difference was that I'd eventually learned to want my own approval more than theirs. I'd found the courage to disappoint people I loved because the alternative, disappointing myself, had become unbearable. But Sarah was still trapped in that earlier stage, still believing that love meant making yourself smaller so everyone else could feel bigger, still thinking that her job was to be the person everyone needed her to be, rather than the person she actually was. That afternoon, I drove to her apartment, a tidy complex on the outskirts of town that managed to look both expensive and soulless. She answered the door in yoga pants and an oversized t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. Without makeup, she looked younger, more like the girl I remembered. "I wasn't expecting company," she said, but she stepped aside to let me in. Her apartment was exactly what I'd expected. Neutral colors, coordinated furniture, everything in its place. It looked like a catalog spread, beautiful, but devoid of personality. The only splash of real color came from a painting propped against the far wall, turned away from view. "Is that it?" I asked, nodding towards the canvas. She hesitated, then walked over and slowly turned it around. I sucked in a breath. The painting was alive in a way that nothing else in the room was. Bold strokes of gold and green depicting our field, but transformed. The ordinary grass became waves of light. The oak tree reached towards a sky that swirled with possibilities, and in the center of it all, two figures stood with their arms raised towards the stars, ready to fly. "Sarah," I whispered, "this is incredible." "It's just a hobby," she said automatically, but I could hear the longing in her voice. "No, this is not a hobby. This is who you are." She stood beside me, studying the painting as if seeing it for the first time. "Sometimes I come home from the office and I sit here staring at it, trying to remember what it felt like to believe in something this much. What did it feel like? Like I could breathe, like I mattered, like the world was big enough for all the things I wanted to create." She touched the corner of the frame with one finger. "I have 17 more paintings in my closet. Landscapes, portraits, abstracts, all the things I told myself I didn't have time for." "Show me." For the next hour, Sarah pulled canvases from her bedroom closet like she was revealing secret states. Each painting was better than the last. Confident brushwork, vivid colors, compositions that spoke of someone who saw the world differently than everyone else. They were good. More than good. They were the work of a real artist who'd been pretending to be someone else. "Why are they hidden?" I asked as we sat surrounded by her secret life. "Because they're proof that I'm selfish, that I spent time and money on things that don't matter to anyone but me, that I'm not the responsible, practical person everyone thinks I am. Or they're proof that you're human, that you have something important to offer the world, that you matter beyond your ability to make other people comfortable." She picked up a painting of a woman dancing alone in a field of wildflowers, joyful, abandoned, free. "What if I showed these to people and they hated them? What if I'm not as good as I think I am? What if you are? What if you're better?" That's almost scarier. I understood that fear intimately. Success meant you could no longer hide behind the excuse of not trying. It meant owning your choices and their consequences. It meant being visible in a way that made you vulnerable to judgment and criticism and the possibility of falling short. "Sarah," I said carefully, "what would happen if you called off the wedding?" Her hands stilled on the painting. "I can't do that." "But what would happen if you did?" "Tom would be devastated. His family would blame me. My parents would be mortified. The whole town would talk about how I broke that poor boy's heart and threw away the perfect life they'd all been envious of." And then what? What do you mean, and then what? I mean, they'd talk, they'd judge, they'd be disappointed, and then what? The world would end, the sun would stop rising, everyone would shun you forever? She was quiet for a long moment. No, I suppose life would go on, and you'd be free to paint, to travel, to figure out who you actually are when you're not trying to be what everyone else needs. It's not that simple, Maya. It's exactly that simple. It's not easy, but it is simple. We sat in silence, surrounded by the evidence of her hidden life, the proof that beneath all the careful construction of the perfect existence, the real Sarah was still there, still creating, still dreaming, still hoping that someday she'd have the courage to let the world see who she really was. "I'm getting married in 3 months," she said finally. "You're planning a wedding in 3 months. Getting married is something you choose to do. Planning a wedding is just a series of tasks on a to-do list. You make it sound like I can just walk away. You can. It would be hard. It would hurt people. It would disappoint everyone who has expectations about your life, but you can." She looked around at her paintings, at all the evidence of the woman she'd been hiding from the world, and I saw something shift in her expression. Not resolution, not yet, but possibility. The faint recognition that she had choices she'd forgotten about, options that existed beyond the narrow path she'd been walking. What would I do? How would I support myself? I can't exactly make a living painting landscapes in Millfield, Texas. You could move. People do it every day. And leave my family? My whole life is here. Your whole performance is here, I corrected gently. Your life, your real life, is in those paintings. It's in the woman who reads stories about being different to other people's children. It's in the person who texts her cousin at midnight because she can't sleep for dreaming of sunflowers. She stood up, walking to the window that looked out over the parking lot of her complex. Beyond it, I could see the fields where we'd once planned our escapes. "I don't know if I'm brave enough," she said to her reflection in the glass. "You don't have to be brave enough for the whole thing at once. You just have to be brave enough for the next step, and then the one after that, and then the one after that." What's the next step? I looked around at the hidden gallery of her real life, at the woman who'd been creating in secret while living someone else's dream. Maybe it's showing your work to someone who isn't me. Maybe it's telling Tom how you really feel. Maybe it's just deciding that your happiness matters as much as everyone else's. Maybe, she said, and for the first time since I'd been back, the word sounded like hope instead of resignation. When I left her apartment that evening, I carried with me the image of Sarah standing among her paintings, seeing herself clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. I didn't know what she would choose, what courage she would find, or what price she would decide she was willing to pay for her freedom. But I knew that the conversation had changed something, that seeds had been planted in soil that had been waiting years for someone to notice it was still fertile, that sometimes all it took to save someone was helping them remember they were worth saving. The question now was whether she would choose to save herself.
Chapter 6: Breaking Points. The call came at 6 in the morning. I fumbled for my phone in the darkness of my childhood bedroom, instantly awake in the way that emergency calls demand. "Maya," Sarah's voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "Can you come over? Something's happened." I dressed quickly and drove through the empty streets of Millfield as the sun painted the sky in watercolors Sarah would have loved. Her apartment door was unlocked, and I found her sitting on her living room floor, surrounded by wedding magazines and color swatches, still wearing yesterday's clothes. I told him, she said without looking up. I told Tom I couldn't marry him. The words hung in the air between us, momentous and final. I sat down beside her on the carpet, careful not to disturb the chaos of wedding plans scattered around us like the remnants of a life that had exploded. How did he take it? About as well as you'd expect. She laughed, but it came out cracked and hollow. He's been calling every hour since midnight. His mother showed up at 2 a.m. demanding an explanation. My mother's been texting me Bible verses about the sanctity of commitment. And how are you? She considered the question seriously, as if no one had bothered to ask. Terrified, relieved, nauseous, free. She picked up a sample invitation with elegant script announcing a wedding that would never happen. Is it possible to feel all of those things at once? It's the only way to feel them, I think. What made you decide? I was lying in bed last night, thinking about our conversation, looking at that painting on my wall, and I realized that I was about to promise to love someone for the rest of my life, when I didn't even know what I loved about myself. How can you give yourself to another person when you don't know who you are? She stood up, stepping carefully around the wedding debris, and walked to the painting we discussed yesterday. I kept thinking about this, about the girl who painted this, about what would happen to her if I went through with the wedding. And I realized she would disappear completely, not just hide, but actually cease to exist. So you chose her instead. I chose the possibility of her. I chose the chance to find out who she might become. Sarah turned to me, and despite the exhaustion and stress, something in her face looked lighter than it had in years. I might have made a terrible mistake, Maya. I might end up alone and broke and disappointing everyone I love, but at least it'll be my mistake. Before I could respond, someone pounded on her front door. We looked at each other, and I saw fear flicker across Sarah's face. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, you open this door right now. The voice belonged to her mother, backed by what sounded like a small army of family members. They've been taking shifts, Sarah said quietly, making sure I don't do anything else reckless before they can talk sense into me. The knocking continued, joined now by multiple voices, her parents, Tom's parents, Uncle Jim's booming bass. Through the thin apartment walls, I could hear Tom's voice pleading for her to just talk to him, to explain what had changed, to give him a chance to fix whatever was wrong. You don't have to see them, I said, not until you're ready. They're not going to give up. This is a small town, Maya. Everyone knows everyone's business, and everyone has an opinion about how everyone else should live. The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of a key in the lock. Sarah's mother had let herself in, followed by what looked like half of Millfield's social register. The small apartment filled with people who'd come to stage an intervention. Sarah, honey, what's gotten into you? Aunt Carol's voice was pitched high with distress. Tom is beside himself. Do you have any idea what you've done? I know exactly what I've done, Sarah said, but I could hear her confidence wavering under the weight of their collective disappointment. You've ruined everything, Mrs. Richardson added, Tom's mother's face red with indignation. The deposits, the planning, the humiliation? The humiliation? Sarah's voice sharpened. This is about your humiliation? It's about your responsibility, Uncle Jim interjected. To Tom, to both families, to the community.
You can't just change your mind about something this important because you got cold feet. It's not cold feet, I said, stepping closer to Sarah. It's called making an adult decision about her own life. The room went quiet, everyone suddenly remembering I was there. I could feel the weight of their judgment, their assumption that I was somehow responsible for Sarah's sudden rebellion against everything they considered right and proper. "This is your influence," Tom's father said, pointing at me with barely contained anger. Filling her head with ideas about how she needs to find herself or some California nonsense. "Nobody filled my head with anything," Sarah said, finding her voice again. "I've been thinking about this for months, years maybe. I just finally found the courage to admit it." Courage. Her mother's laugh was sharp and bitter. "There's nothing courageous about breaking a good man's heart and throwing away a perfect life. That's not courage, Sarah. That's selfishness." "Maybe it is," Sarah said, and I heard something new in her voice. Not defiance, exactly, but a quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. Maybe I need to be selfish for once in my life. Maybe I need to care about what I want more than I care about what you want for me. The room erupted in voices, protests, arguments, attempts at reasoning and emotional manipulation. Through it all, Sarah stood her ground, answering their accusations with a calm that seemed to come from some deep well of resolve I hadn't known she possessed. "I'm not changing my mind," she said when the noise died down. "I'm sorry that disappoints you. I'm sorry it inconveniences you. I'm sorry it doesn't fit with your plans for my life, but I'm not changing my mind." "And what exactly do you plan to do with yourself?" Mrs. Richardson demanded. "How do you plan to support yourself when you've thrown away the best opportunity you'll ever have?" "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted, "but I'll figure it out." "That's not an answer, young lady. That's a fantasy." "Then I guess I'm living in a fantasy, but at least it's my fantasy instead of yours." One by one, they filed out of the apartment, leaving behind warnings about regret and lectures about responsibility. Tom was the last to leave, standing in Sarah's doorway with tears in his eyes and confusion written across his face. "I don't understand. I thought you were happy. I thought we were happy." "We were comfortable," Sarah said gently, "but comfortable isn't the same thing as happy." "What did I do wrong?" "Nothing, Tom. You didn't do anything wrong. This isn't about you. It's about me, about who I am and who I want to become." "Can't you become that person with me?" "I don't think so. I think I need to figure out who I am on my own first." After he left, Sarah sank back down onto the floor, emotionally exhausted but still standing. Around us, the apartment felt different, no longer a showroom, but a space where real life had finally happened. "That was awful," she said. "But you did it. You stood up to all of them and you didn't back down." "I hurt people I care about." "Yes, and they'll recover. People are more resilient than they want you to believe." She gathered up the scattered wedding magazines, stacking them into a neat pile that would probably go straight into the recycling bin. "What happens now?" "Now, you figure out what comes next, one step at a time." "Will you help me?" I looked at this woman who'd finally chosen herself over everyone else's expectations, who'd found the courage to disappoint people she loved in order to save her own life. She was scared and uncertain and had no idea what her future would look like, but she was free For the first time in years, she was completely free. "Of course," I said. "That's what family is for." Outside, the sun was fully up, beginning another day in Millfield, Texas. But inside Sarah's apartment, something had shifted irrevocably. The woman who'd been hiding behind perfection for so long had finally stepped into the light, messy and uncertain, but authentically herself. It was a beginning.
Chapter 7: Seeds of Change. The next few days passed in a blur of damage control and difficult conversations. Word of Sarah's broken engagement spread through Millfield like wildfire, and the reactions ranged from shocked disappointment to outright hostility. I found myself in the strange position of being both Sarah's support system and the family's scapegoat, the bad influence from California who'd corrupted their perfect daughter. But something unexpected was happening too. In quiet moments, when the public outrage died down and people stopped performing their shock for each other's benefit, some of the family began to approach us individually. Different conversations, private admissions, small cracks in the facade of universal disapproval. It started with Jessica, my cousin Mark's wife, who cornered me at the grocery store on Thursday morning. "I know everyone's blaming you for Sarah's decision," she said, quietly, glancing around to make sure no one could overhear. "But I wanted you to know that some of us think she's brave." Brave? I married Mark when I was 22 because it was what everyone expected. Don't get me wrong, I love him, I love our kids, I'm happy with the life we built. But I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd taken time to figure out who I was before I became half of a couple. She paused, studying a display of cereal with intense concentration. Sarah's got a chance to know herself before she commits to anyone else. That's not selfish, that's smart. Similar conversations followed throughout the week. Uncle Jim, surprisingly, pulled me aside after church on Sunday to admit that he'd always wondered what would have happened if he'd followed through on his dream of opening a music studio instead of taking over his father's insurance business. "Not saying I regret my choices," he said carefully, "but a man gets to wondering, you know? What if I'd had the guts to disappoint people and chase something that mattered to me?" Even Aunt Linda, Sarah's harshest critic, softened slightly after a few days of reflection. "I'm worried about her," she confessed during a quiet moment on Mom's back porch. "What if she can't make it on her own? What if she ends up alone and struggling? What if she ends up fulfilled and happy?" I countered gently. "Is that possible? Really? Can someone just change their whole life like that? Look at me. I did it." She studied my face as if seeing me clearly for the first time. "You did, didn't you? Are you happy, Maya? Really happy?" It was the first time anyone in my family had asked me that question directly, without judgment or assumption. "Yes," I said. "It's scary sometimes, it's uncertain. It's nothing like what I thought my life would look like when I was 20. But yes, I'm happy." "And you don't regret leaving?" "I regret that it took me so long to visit. I regret that I let fear of your disapproval keep me away. But I don't regret building the life I wanted instead of the one you wanted for me." She was quiet for a long time, rocking gently in Mom's old porch swing. "Maybe I've been thinking about this all wrong," she said eventually. "Maybe success isn't about following a script. Maybe it's about writing your own story." The most surprising conversation came from Dad, who knocked on my bedroom door Thursday night and asked if we could talk. "I owe you an apology," he said, settling into the chair by my window.
I've been so focused on worrying about you that I never stopped to see what you'd accomplished. Your mother showed me that article about your company in the business journal. I'm proud of you, Maya. I should have said that years ago. Thank you, I managed, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I was scared when you left. Scared you'd get hurt. Scared you'd fail. Scared I'd failed as a father by not giving you reasons to stay. But I can see now that you needed to go, that staying would have been the real failure. I needed your support too, though. I needed to know that you believed in me. I did believe in you. I just didn't believe in a world that would appreciate you the way we do. I wanted to protect you from disappointment, but I ended up becoming part of what you needed protection from. We talked until late that night, bridging years of misunderstanding with honest conversation. He told me about his own deferred dreams, about the novel he'd always wanted to write but convinced himself was impractical. I told him about the loneliness of success, about the nights I'd wondered if I'd traded too much family connection for personal fulfillment. Maybe, he said as he got up to leave, it's not too late for any of us to figure out how to support each other's dreams instead of each other's fears. Meanwhile, Sarah was navigating her own series of difficult conversations and surprising discoveries. She'd started the process of untangling her life from Tom's, separating finances, returning gifts, having painful but necessary conversations about the future they'd planned that would never happen. But she was also doing something more important. She was painting. Every morning, she set up an easel in her living room and worked for hours, creating with an intensity and focus that seemed to make up for years of denied expression. The hidden paintings came out of the closet, joined by new work that grew bolder and more confident each day. I forgot how it felt, she told me, as we sat in her apartment surrounded by canvases in various stages of completion. To lose track of time because you're so absorbed in what you're doing. To feel like you're channeling something larger than yourself. What are you going to do with them? I've been thinking about that. She gestured toward a landscape that captured the Texas hill country in shades of gold and amber that seemed to glow from within. Mrs. Patterson at the library mentioned that there's an art gallery in Austin that specializes in regional artists, and there's a coffee shop in San Antonio that rotates local work every month. You're thinking of showing your work? I'm thinking of trying. For the first time in my life, I'm thinking of risking failure instead of guaranteeing mediocrity. She'd also been researching art programs, looking into everything from weekend workshops to full-time degrees, not because she needed permission to call herself an artist, but because she wanted to push herself, to learn from people who could help her grow. I might move to Austin, she said, the words coming out in a rush, as if she'd been afraid to say them out loud. There's an art community there, galleries, other people trying to make a living from their creativity. It's scary, but it's also exciting. What about your job? I gave my notice yesterday, 2 weeks to tie up loose ends, and then I'm officially unemployed for the first time since college. She looked terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, like someone standing at the edge of a cliff with wings she wasn't sure would work, but was finally ready to test. Sarah, I'm so proud of you. For what? For making a mess of my life? For choosing your life, for deciding that you matter, for being brave enough to disappoint people you love in order to save yourself. That Friday, Sarah organized something unprecedented in Millfield, an art showing in her apartment. She invited family, friends, coworkers, anyone who wanted to see what she'd been hiding all these years. Most people didn't come, but some did, enough to matter. I watched her stand beside her paintings, answering questions about technique and inspiration, explaining her work to people who were seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. She was nervous but glowing, alive in a way I hadn't seen since we were teenagers, dreaming of conquering the world. Mrs. Patterson bought the painting of our field, insisting on paying full price despite Sarah's protests. "This belongs in the library," she said, "where other young dreamers can see it and remember that some launching pads actually work." Uncle Jim stood for a long time in front of a portrait Sarah had painted of her grandmother, tears streaming down his face. "She would have been so proud of you for following your heart," he said. Even some people who'd been critical of Sarah's decision seemed moved by her work. I overheard conversations about talent and courage, about what it meant to pursue something you loved rather than something that looked good on paper. It wasn't universal acceptance. Many family members stayed away, and the social consequences of her choices were still unfolding. But it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of conventional thinking that had kept so many dreams locked away. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Sarah pulled me aside. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what? For seeing me? For remembering who I used to be and helping me remember too? For showing me that it's possible to live a life that actually belongs to you? You did the hard part. You chose yourself." "We both did," she said, and I realized she was right. Coming home had been my own choice, to stop running from the disapproval and complexity of family love, to find a way to be myself while still being their daughter, their cousin, their prodigal child who'd found her way back to a different kind of belonging. Outside, Millfield settled into another quiet Friday night. But inside Sarah's apartment, surrounded by paintings that told the truth about dreams and courage and the possibility of change, something new was beginning. Not just for Sarah, but for all of us who'd been brave enough to witness what happened when someone finally chose themselves over everyone else's expectations. It was a small revolution, but revolutions have to start somewhere. And sometimes they start in small-town apartments with a woman and her paintings, showing the world what authentic living looks like, one brushstroke at a time. Chapter 8. New Beginnings. 6 months later, I found myself back in Millfield for Christmas. But this time, the visit felt different. The fear was gone, replaced by something that felt like coming home to people who actually knew who I was. The conversations were easier, the silences more comfortable, the love more honest and less conditional. Sarah had moved to Austin in October, renting a small studio apartment in an arts district where her neighbors were musicians and writers and other people brave enough to bet on their dreams. She'd had her first gallery showing in November, a group exhibition featuring emerging Texas artists, and sold 3 paintings to strangers who connected with her vision of wild, possible worlds. She was waitressing to pay the bills while building her portfolio, living on a budget that would have horrified her former self, and loving every precarious moment of it.
The woman who'd once hidden her art in closets now spent her days painting in a studio with windows that faced the morning sun, creating work that grew bolder and more confident with each passing week. "I wake up excited about my day," she told me over coffee during my Christmas visit. We were sitting in the same diner where we'd spent teenage afternoons, but now we were different people having different conversations. Even when I'm tired, even when I'm scared about money, even when I have no idea what I'm doing, I wake up excited to be living my own life instead of someone else's idea of what my life should look like. She looked healthy in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance. There was a lightness to her, an energy that came from alignment between who she was and how she was living. She'd gained weight from eating when she was hungry instead of when anxiety demanded it, and her skin had a glow that expensive cosmetics had never achieved. "Any regrets?" I asked. "About ending things with Tom? No. About waiting so long to start? Every day." Tom had taken a job in Dallas, leaving Millfield for the first time in his life. Word was that he was dating someone new, a teacher who apparently appreciated his steady, traditional approach to life in ways that Sarah never could. It seemed like everyone had found their way to where they belonged. The family dynamics had shifted too, in subtle but important ways. Mom still asked about my love life and when I might think about settling down, but now the questions felt more like genuine curiosity than urgent intervention. Dad had started writing, not the novel he'd once dreamed of, but essays about small-town life that the local paper had begun publishing. Uncle Jim had bought a guitar and was teaching himself to play, something he'd wanted to do since high school, but had convinced himself was impractical. Even Aunt Linda had made changes, signing up for photography class and discovering that she had an eye for capturing moments that revealed the beauty in ordinary things. It was as if Sarah's courage to change her life had given others permission to examine their own choices, to consider what dreams they'd deferred and whether it might not be too late to revive them. "You started something," I told Sarah as we walked through downtown Millfield on Christmas Eve, past familiar storefronts decorated with lights and garland. "People are thinking differently about what's possible. Or maybe they were always thinking about it and just needed to see that someone could actually do it." We ended up at our old field, now dusted with snow, but otherwise unchanged. The oak tree stood sentinel under a star-filled sky that seemed close enough to touch. It was the same place where we'd once planned impossible escapes, but now we understood that the real escape had never been about geography. It had been about permission. Permission to want things, to try for them, to fail and try again, to build lives that made sense to us, even if they looked strange to everyone else. "I have something for you," Sarah said, pulling a small canvas from her bag. It was a painting of two women standing in this field, but unlike the hidden painting in her apartment, these figures weren't looking up at the stars. They were looking at each other, grounded and present and connected, despite the different paths their lives had taken. "It's us," she said. "Now, not who we were or who we thought we should become, but who we actually are." I studied the painting through tears, seeing in it the truth of our friendship, how we'd supported each other across distance and difference, how we'd helped each other remember that love doesn't require conformity, that family doesn't mean giving up yourself to make everyone else comfortable. "I love it," I said, "and I love you for becoming who you were meant to be."
right back at you. We stood together in the field of our childhood, two women who'd learned that following your dreams doesn't mean leaving love behind. It means finding people who love you enough to let you be yourself, even when that self looks nothing like what they expected. My phone buzzed with a text from David, sending Christmas wishes from San Francisco and updates about the company we'd built together. In a few days, I'd return to that life, to the work that challenged and fulfilled me, to the city that had taught me it was possible to start over and become whoever you wanted to be. But I'd also return knowing that home wasn't a place you had to choose between you and your dreams. Home was the people who saw you clearly and loved you anyway, who celebrated your successes and supported your failures, who understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone disappoint you in order to save themselves. Sarah would stay in Austin, building her art career one painting at a time, learning to trust her voice and her vision. She'd probably struggle financially, face rejection and criticism, wonder sometimes if she'd made the right choice, but she'd do it as herself, fully and authentically, without apology or pretense. And maybe that was the real lesson of coming home. Not that you had to choose between love and authenticity, but that real love made authenticity possible. That the people worth keeping in your life were the ones who wanted you to be happy more than they wanted you to be convenient. As we walked back toward town, I thought about the different kinds of courage required to build a meaningful life. The courage to leave when staying meant disappearing, the courage to stay when running would be easier, the courage to disappoint people you love when the alternative is disappointing yourself, the courage to change when change feels impossible, and the courage to let others change when their transformation challenges your comfortable assumptions about who they are and what they owe you. Most of all, the courage to believe that you matter, that your dreams and desires and authentic self are worthy of pursuit and defense, even when pursuing them means walking a lonely path toward an uncertain destination. Behind us, the field lay quiet under winter stars, holding space for all the dreams that had been born there and all the ones yet to come. Some launching pads, it turned out, never stopped working. They just waited patiently for the next dreamers brave enough to use them. The traveler's journal of my heart closed on this chapter of coming home, but opened immediately to the next, the ongoing story of a life lived deliberately, with love for the people who shaped us and courage for the paths we choose to walk. Some stories, the best ones, never really end. They just become the foundation for whatever beautiful, terrifying, authentic thing comes next. In the distance, the lights of Millfield twinkled like earthbound stars, marking the place where two women had learned that you don't have to choose between loving your family and loving yourself. You just have to be brave enough to believe you deserve both, and patient enough to help everyone else learn that lesson too. The end. Author's note. This story explores themes of authenticity, family expectations, and the courage required to live a life true to yourself. It's dedicated to anyone who has ever felt torn between loving others and becoming themselves. May you find the wisdom to know you can do both.